interior of the automobile, where dramatic changes are going to happen and are happening because of autonomous vehicles. He also has, as a distinguished characteristic, the fact that he has a Haas MBA, and he also had the curse of taking a course on dynamic capabilities quite some time ago. So we can probe him to see if he learned anything from that, and also learn a lot about what's going on in the industry and how he sees the future unfolding. So that's after the break. Where I'd like to start today is where we finished off last time, which is talking about this whole concept of disruption. Now, you remember that Clay Christensen from the Harvard Business School really popularized this notion, even though it goes back to Joseph Schumpeter, the notion that the product and the new technology overturns existing incumbents and shakes up an industry. It's a very old idea. We've all known about it for 100 plus years. But Professor Christensen brought new life to the topic, and he also got his book endorsed by Bill Gates, and his study received an enormous amount of attention. Now, his study wasn't just about disruption, it was about a particular kind of disruption. And just to remind you, the Christensen narrative is, and he claims it's a general case, but I think now we would say it's a special case. The Christensen narrative is that disruption comes from the bottom. So I've drawn here a little bit on Josh Gans, who's a professor at University of Toronto, and he's got a quite nice piece in the Harvard Business Review, which is, appropriately critical of Christensen's perspective, because Christensen's perspective is that the new entrant comes in at the bottom. For some reason, the incumbents don't pay attention. So it's implicitly assuming that the incumbents are asleep at the switch, and they don't initially lose too many customers because, after all, it's the bottom end of the market. But then over time, and often very quickly, the new entrant improves their game and then goes after the core customers. So that's the story that we saw. I think the first classic study of that was Honda entering the motorcycle business, beginning with a Honda 50, a low-end bike, and then moving up to the 150, 250, 350, and then with Yamaha essentially driving the British and the American bikes out of the market. This is back in the late 60s and 70s. Now, that obviously occurs, and the question is, why did it occur? Well, basically, Honda succeeded because its bikes were technologically more advanced. Eventually, manufacturers like Harley-Davidson very much stayed in the business, not through better technology, but through style. So Honda and Suzuki and the Japanese companies didn't take the entire market, but they certainly took the utility end of the market, and they also took a good deal of the high performance end of the market. But in terms of style and statement, the Harley-Davidsons have still stayed into the market, even though I think Harley went through bankruptcy once, maybe twice. But what Gans says is that, well, the kind of demand side disruption that Christensen's talking about is not as difficult to deal with as what he calls supply side disruption. And he uses the example of the iPhone and what it did to BlackBerry and to Nokia. We've talked about what it did to Nokia, of course, but remember, the high end of the market before the iPhone was BlackBerry. In fact, I think Obama was still using a BlackBerry because in the end, the BlackBerry did have one feature, which was security, that was even better than Apple's, at least so we thought initially. But the initial response of BlackBerry and of Nokia was to build phones that looked more like the iPhone. But as Gans points out, it was really a whole different conception of what the phone is about. It was no longer a phone with a computer. It was a computer with a phone feature. And the new entrants, in this case, Samsung, which really wasn't significant in the iPhone business or in the phone business, in the mobile phone business, should I say, they had an easy job because they didn't have to turn their supply chain upside down. So Gans's narrative is that disruption is more dangerous. This is something for you to think about. Disruption is more dangerous when it comes or when it has supply side implications than when it has demand side implications. Today we're going to be talking about the automobile industry, so keep that in mind. The damage or the difficulty of adjusting to new competition is more difficult if it's driven from the supply side than the demand side. Of course, as we'll see with autonomous vehicles and with electric vehicles and all that, that's probably more of a supply side incursion than it is a demand side incursion. And the reason for that, and this is the conclusion, that the reason for that, why is it harder, is because if you end up having to disrupt the whole product architecture, then you disrupt the whole supply chain and you disrupt essentially the way a company does business. So it's more fundamental, according to Gans, it's more fundamental if it comes from the supply side. Now, these are conjectures. There's not a lot of evidence supporting this one way or the other, but I do think it's an important distinction to think about whether the disruption you're dealing with is demand side or supply side. Very simple distinction, but it does make a difference in terms of how you think about it and how you act. So let me just pause there to see if we have any questions about this general concept of disruption and the Christensen perspective and the Josh Gans perspective, and they're not incompatible. I'd say they're complementary rather than competitive with each other.
Hey, Professor. So I guess like the summary would be that supply side taps into latent demand, whereas demand side just targets a lower end of the market where there just could be more demand.
Yeah, I think that his distinction is the demand side. You've got a product that's not made too differently, and I suppose the automobile. If you think about Hyundai in automobiles, it really wasn't using anything different on the supply side. It was just a smaller, cheaper car. Eventually, there was more differentiation, but it didn't require you to turn the business inside out to respond to it. So, you're probing on these things because, let's suppose I produce a cheap version of the iPhone. That doesn't require a change in the supply side, but it does, it sets a lower price point. So basically, I think what Gans is saying is that, you can almost think of the business model and the way of doing business as two separate things. That if something doesn't disrupt the business model, then it's easier. And if it doesn't disrupt the supply chain, then it's easier to handle. But the more things that it disrupts, the more parts of the business that it disrupts, the more troubling it is to deal with. And it's essentially a capabilities view when you think about it. What Gans is saying is that if it really requires a different set of capabilities, then it's a more dangerous form of disruption. So as we said before with Nokia, they really had so much to change. And in a way, Nokia, Samsung was in a way better position to deal with the iPhone because it didn't have any significant investments. And it was an opening for Samsung, whereas Nokia, being, having like 35-40% of the world market, had so much committed to the old technology. So it's really about the flexibility that you have given the supply chain and the current investments you currently have. I mean, I think in a way that's what's going on here. Any other comments or questions? And by the way, I love it if you turn your cameras on. I noticed a lot of you don't have it on, and maybe it's because you're eating your dinner or something, which is fine. But it's easier for me if I see more than 6 or 8 of you. All right. Any other questions, comments? You got this disruption thing? Because if you got this disruption thing all figured out, now we're going to talk about autonomous cars. You'll be able to figure out which companies to short. You figure out whether you're going to short GM and Ford and Mercedes-Benz, or whether you're going to short Tesla. And you're also going to be able to figure out, how if you're a manager, put yourself in the position of GM management or Toyota management or Volkswagen management. How do you deal with this thing? It's a huge disruption because, as we'll see, it's not just a technological disruption. It's arguably, well, not just arguably, it's a business model disruption as well. So let's move on. Just one last point on the Christensen thing. The quintessential case that proves its point is the photolithography industry, where Canon actually being it sort of turns the story on its head a little bit. In photolithography, Rebecca Henderson at Harvard as well, she did this study of which companies survived and which companies succeeded when there was a change in the industry architecture. She actually found the ones that were more integrated and that could rework and could essentially contribute to all the new emerging technologies were the ones that succeeded, and that was Canon. These are very complicated stories. So don't think, when you read this stuff, if you get confused, it's not that you're not understanding, it's that the story is still confusing. The last word is not being said on the nature of disruption and how to respond to it. The last word will probably never be said on what disruption is and how to respond to it. But I think the more you read these stories, the more you read other people's efforts to make sense of it, the better you're going to be prepared to manage disruption and to deal with it every day. I haven't figured it out yet, so I'm not pretending that anybody's figured it out. Christensen thought he had figured it out, and Josh Gans and others pointed out that he hadn't figured it out, and Christensen was a sufficient gentleman to say, you're right. So just to animate the study about what's going on with autonomous vehicles, I was driving behind a Waymo car today in San Francisco. They're still putting millions and millions and millions of miles testing the autonomous cars. And I think 2 or 3 years ago, we thought that we'll be here by now, and they're not. And I have an ongoing debate with my good friend John Blair at the Berkeley Research Group, who's a software engineer, who keeps saying, it's a long way off, David, it's a long way off, because it's a much harder job. Once you get off of freeways, for sure, it's a much harder job than most people think to build the software that you need to have absolutely flawless and safe autonomous vehicles. Anyway, what we see is activity. Apple, remember, 2 or 3 years ago, it had an autonomous car division and was talking like there was going to be an Apple car. And that led me to be very, to ask the hard question: who's going to win here? Is it going to be the Apples and the Googles of the world that have got the new software technology, or is it going to be the incumbent automobile companies that know how to make vehicles at large scale, something that Apple doesn't know how to do, something that Google doesn't know how to do? So it's really a question about which capabilities matter the most. And I think about a year ago, Apple announced that it was scaling back on its autonomous vehicle business. And then we see recently some news articles where Apple is out apparently looking to joint venture with a manufacturer of some kind. And it's always very secretive about the way it does things. So I'm sure Apple was really pissed off that someone in Hyundai in Korea leaked something to the press about their negotiations with Apple. Anyway, may have pissed off Apple, but it gives us some insight into what's going on in the industry and what the dynamics are. So you don't have to read all of this. This is just some news stories. So initially, of course, this announcement was premature and it led to the stock price of Hyundai flying up. But at the end of the day, it went down again, and Apple, really threw cold water on the prospects of a joint venture with Hyundai. But nevertheless, you see some discussion in the press about what's really going on and what were the issues. Look here, Chung Sung Yup, an analyst at Daewoo, says last paragraph here, Hyundai may have found the terms of the negotiations too favorable to Apple, driven by Apple's tough demands for technology sharing, etc. So that's interesting in and of itself, because it seems like Apple is saying, hey, we want you to transfer your technology to us. Quite frankly, that surprises me. I would have thought that Apple would be quite happy to say, okay, guys, you can build the car. We're going to interface with you with our technology. But I was actually surprised to learn that Apple feels like it needs to own the technology or get control of the technology or manufacturing technology, because in the past, I don't think that's something that Apple's done. And continuing on with this, there's also the question with respect to brand. As I understand it from these various news reports, Apple, of course, was bargaining position, at least was, oh, and by the way, this is going to be an Apple car. It's not going to be a Hyundai car. It's not going to be an Apple Hyundai car. It's going to be an Apple car. And so you can understand the automotive companies, including Hyundai, and wouldn't like that. It's just like people that feel that Amazon, buries their brand. And the concern would be that all the brand value associated with success, assuming that success is going to go to Apple. So there is a significant tug of war over branding. I'll let you also think about that. Which way does that play? So let's sort of open up this discussion a little bit more. And I've given you some readings on this. I actually wrote about autonomous vehicles, and in particular, my focus was on the role of 5G mobile, because there needs to be an enabling technology for all of this stuff to work. We wouldn't be talking about autonomous cars, I don't think, without the improvements in communications technology, which have been coming along and which are substantially here today. And 5G is not the only technology that's going to be used for the connected car, but it's an important one. And the first 5G standards have now been issued, and the technology is slowly starting to get installed. It's going very fast in China. reasonably fast in the United States and quite slow in Europe. Um, so, um, so what are the elements of disruption that autonomous cars are creating? Um, I think one way to think about this is that the car of the future is clearly in some fundamental sense, a connected computer on wheels. And when you step into a Tesla, you do feel like you're stepping closer to the computer. You do feel like you're stepping closer to an iPhone with a big screen and so forth. And so the question is, what are the capabilities that are going to be needed to drive forward this industry? How important are traditional automobile technologies? How important is the computer, the data management side, and the LiDAR or the radar that sits on the top of the car? Obviously, these are critical elements of what an autonomous car is all about. But at the end of the day, it's the integration of them all too. So we can identify, quite a number of key blocks of technology that are going to be needed. But then someone has to integrate them and make them all work together. And this is more challenging than the current automobile. Current automobile is a system, but we're talking about with the connected car and even broader, the boundaries of the system, if you will, have been extended dramatically, or will be extended dramatically to include other vehicles on the road, to include other modalities of transportation, and so forth. So there's a huge systems integration and systems engineering job that has to be done to make autonomous vehicles work as well. And so one interesting thing is, what are the technologies? What's the character of these technologies? To some extent, they're general purpose technologies, which is not primarily what the focus is today. But it is important to recognize that 5G is not going to be used just in autonomous cars. It's going to be used in just about everything, not just your phone, but there'll be sensors in everything and anything. And the degree to which the economy is going to be connected is going to go up by many orders of magnitude because of the capabilities that 5G provides. Let's sort of go ahead a little bit here to think about what vehicle to vehicle, that's V2X, vehicle to or whatever communications in the area of increased highway capacity do. What are we likely to see? We're likely to see high density platooning. I won't like that very much myself. I don't want someone else's car to be, 1 foot from my nose when I look out the window. But this is apparently what a connected highway system would eventually look like. Lane changes would be coordinated, and we get greater density, and the highway capacity goes up dramatically if, in fact, you can do this platooning. Not only are there less accidents, but there's a lot of empty space between cars. If a car's traveling at 60 miles an hour, you're supposed to be leave 6 car distances as a gap. Well, just think, that means you could have 5 additional cars in there traveling down the road, which is, a very significant increase in capacity. There would be greater capacity as well as supposedly greater safety. That's the vision that some people believe we're heading towards. I'm not passing an opinion on that myself because I don't really know. But let me just sort of indicate that we're talking about something here that is of enormous size. The sales enablement due to 5G in the automotive sector is, we're talking trillions of dollars. Of course, at the time I did this slide, which is 3 years ago, $1 trillion sounded like a lot of money. But now we have the Biden bill where $2 trillion is being put down for the second time. $1 trillion. And by the way, that amount of money I read, if it's a single dollar notes, will take you, if you stack them up, will take you halfway to the moon. If I remember right, what is the moon? Is it 600,000 miles away, something like that? Ian, you'll have to remind me. So it's if it's halfway to the moon, it's 300,000 miles. Would be the height of the stack of dollars.
About 240,000 miles.
240,000. Okay, so it'd be 120,000 miles or thereabouts. So we're talking about here with the automotive industry, we're talking about the largest disruption ever. I mean, mobile phone, when it came out, of course, there were no other mobile phones to be disrupted. In the end, it disrupted landlines, wherever landlines existed. But that was a 20 to 30 year process, although in certain countries like in Africa or in Russia, where the landline system was really not functioning or non-existent, the disruption was pretty small. A country like Italy, which had terrible, even though it was a developed country, the phone system was absolutely terrible. Thank God for mobile phones. They saved many advanced economies as well as developing economies. But, we're talking about, multiple trillions of dollars being at stake. So getting the disruption story right, whether it's, Josh Gans's version or Christensen's version, if we can understand this better, the payoff, the size of the numbers and the payoff matrix that we're talking about impacting are very, very large. So in the automotive industry, this is 3 years ago, we predicted, or actually it was using, I think, a version of the Wharton model, that what was at stake was 12 trillion of sales going to be impacted here, which is very large. So where are we in this discussion about autonomous vehicles? I think we're still in the sensing and sense-making part of it, and about to begin execution or the seizing part of it. I mean, if you think about it, those press releases about Hyundai and Apple, they're at least about talking about building autonomous vehicles at scale. And I'm sure initially it'll be robo-taxis or something like that. But we're still very much in the sense-making phase, and we're dealing with deep ambiguity. We're dealing with uncertainty, particularly secondary uncertainty, which is about the behavior of ourselves and government institutions. You remember the autonomous car in Arizona, I believe, that knocked over and killed a pedestrian in the middle of the night, crossing in the dark. Little incidents like that put back the development of the industry dramatically, because suddenly the regulators start getting worried, and public officials are always worried about being criticized and short of leadership skills. And so what they do when things like that happen, even though statistically it doesn't indicate anything significant, they just delay everything another 5 years. So one death can delay public officials' execution of policies and standards and protocols for 3 or 4 years. So there's all kinds of things that can slow it down, but very few that can speed it up. But nevertheless, it's a disruption that's coming, and we got to understand it and try and analyze it. Now, here's the table I made 3 or 4 years ago. I'm just reviewing it again tonight for the class, and I'm not sure it's right. But these were some guesses. Really, what you remember, we had a diagram, I think in the class before last, where we talked about capability distance, that how hard it is for a company to change is a function of how many capabilities it has to change at once and how much it has to change them. And we had 3 dimensions on that 3-dimensional chart. There was a technology distance, a business model distance, and a market distance. And here we have, 4 different categories of vehicles: electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, connected cars, and personal mobility, and an assessment of which, how big the challenge is. Is it 0? For some reason, I put in 0 for autonomous cars and business models. I don't know why I did that. I think it's probably wrong. But there clearly is no circumstance where it's 0 in every column for any particular category of vehicles. So there is distance, if you will, capability distance, which I suggest to you. Capability distance is a useful strategic variable. I'm not sure anybody's popularized it, and if you want to write a book on capability distance, you may get famous, just like Christensen wrote one on disruption. If you can figure out and write about and create some structure around how to think about capability distance, I would very much applaud it and almost guarantee you commercial success if you do a good job. So, of course, we have the great benefit that we're sitting here in 2021, and we've got the Tesla model, not just Tesla, but a number of other companies now that are moving forward, not so much with autonomous cars, but certainly with electric cars. And this is leading to this huge debate about, well, what's the hard part of this industry? Is it the new technology, or is it manufacturing, automobiles at scale? Of course, the bottom line here, no one knows the answers to these questions. So what you have to do when there's deep uncertainty, remember this comes back to how do you make decisions under deep uncertainty? And the answer is you decide. You don't analyze forever. You've got to, have what John Maynard Keynes called animal spirits, which of course, it doesn't go down well in the boardroom, because every board member is thinking about their risk and their exposure if the company does something wrong, even though the law actually provides enormous amount of discretion with respect to business decisions, not around issues like safety, not around issues like negligence, but bona fide good business decisions. Boards of directors have a lot of independence and protection under the law, but at the same time, people don't want to do things wrong, and so as a consequence, they tend to procrastinate forever. So the dynamic capabilities framework says don't procrastinate forever, get going, and the reason why you got to get going is because you're going to engage and you're going to learn. And that's not just dynamic capabilities. You get that from the lean startup model we discussed with Eric Ries, and so forth. So it's usually better to act than to sit on the sidelines, and you should be actively collecting business intelligence. That's one way you learn. And there's a lot at stake, not only your own company, but also your national economies and regional economies and so forth. So some academics have actually jumped into this and have tried to look at the costs of designing and producing electric vehicles, but without even picking up a notepad, it's very clear that an Apple and a Google, with a single-digit % of the cash on their balance sheet, have got the financial capital to go into these businesses if they want to. So that tells you one very important thing, is this is not about financial capital. Remember in our discussion of intangible assets, so money doesn't really matter anymore. Money is pretty ubiquitous. You can always find money to get something good done. What you can't find is capabilities. The basic thesis here is that Perkins and Merman, who looked at this, point out that the IT giants, and I think they're right, I think you Google and Apple and Amazon, they still have to master sophisticated manufacturing, which is not in their current experience. So there's a big technology or big manufacturing capability gap that the tech giants have to get across. And just, to borrow a phrase that we used in the last class, it's not just about writing a check. Yes, you can get sort of certain capabilities in-house, but unless you can repurpose them to the problem at hand, you don't really have those capabilities in a functional sense. So the game is which capabilities matter, and that's something that we'll learn about as we go forward here. One of the capabilities, one of the things that we saw with Josh Gann's is analysis of disruption, is that the more radical you have to change the business model and the supply chain and the system, if you will, behind the product, the harder it is to change. So we just have to remember that the way to think about this is in terms of not just the business model, but even on the technology side. Technology is too broad a term. You've got to look at the manufacturing system, the manufacturing technology, as well as the product design system. Now, sometimes we talk about autonomous vehicles and we forget that there's multiple paradigm changes taking place at once. We're not just going from internal combustion engines to autonomous vehicles. We're going from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles that are that they're also connected and autonomous at the same time. So there's multiple sources of change sweeping through the industry. And that's what makes it particularly hard. Go back to the concept of VUCA, volatile, uncertain, ambiguous, complex and ambiguous. What's going on in the automobile industry certainly hits the V on volatility, certainly hits the U in uncertainty, certainly hits the C in complexity, and certainly hits the A in ambiguity. So it's VUCA on steroids, I suppose, is one way to put it, compared to other industries right now. And then, of course, there's the whole question about not just what new technologies are going to be required, what new business models, but where are they going to come from? And China's not been a significant player in the automobile industry until now, but now it is, and now it can be. And that's the reason why the Chinese are incredibly excited about autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles, because they see it not playing to the strength of the incumbent firms, not playing to the strength of Mercedes, not playing to the strength of Ford, not playing to the strength of General Motors. So if you're the new entrant, you start licking your chops thinking about the size of this industry and the fact there's an opening for you. Just as we said before with Samsung in mobile phones, what Apple did with the iPhone created a whole new model, and Samsung, not being a big player at the time, was able to step in and really help destroy Nokia, I suppose. So every time you have a technology shift, every time you have a business model shift, then it plays to the advantage of the new entrants. And the new entrant here in the automobile industry at a high level is China. And indeed, Tesla has already got a plant manufacturing Teslas in China, and there are multiple new startups. And I'm sure that Kareem in the second half of the class is going to tell us about some of these new startups. They're very, very visible. There's like 600 new electric car startups in China. There won't be 600 that survive. And the very smart thing that the Chinese have figured out is that while they want national champions, they're not willing to protect them all, and nor should they be willing to protect them all. But of the 600 or so electric vehicle startups, if half a dozen survive, I'd be surprised. But if there's 600 in China, there's probably several hundred elsewhere in the world as well. So we're talking about a completely different industry. We're at the same place today as we were in 1910 or whatever it is that Henry Ford came out with the Model T. We're sort of where the industry was about 195 years ago. Excuse me, no, not 195. About 100 years ago, maybe 110 years ago. So, in addition to speculating about who's going to win and who's going to lose, that's too narrow a way to define it. The question is, which partnerships are going to win? Are there going to be consortia that are going to win? We shouldn't assume that the right organizational model is just autonomous firms. And it's likely in fact to be some kind of alliance building structure that will succeed. And as the last bullet point points out, their alliance formation is the best way to participate for the time being, particularly with companies that are in China. So we can expect to see very different organizational forms, and you might want to think about what those organizational forms would look like. People are already talking about them, but they're not talking about them publicly. Let me just skip on a little bit more to say that the Tesla story is indeed quite remarkable. You might say that, and this is back in 2018, it was already true by then that Tesla's market cap was in the order of magnitude of GM and Ford. I think today it's equal to almost the rest of the industry put together. Ian, maybe you can update the class on what that number is. And it is really an absolutely, completely remarkable situation. But first bullet point there, it's a tribute to the company's dynamic capabilities. There's no doubt in my mind that it's not just the technology that is the reason why Tesla's doing as well it is. It's because of the fact that it's led by Musk and his top management team, and they're willing to make the kind of gutsy bets that you need to make if you're going to lead. But they've also got enough operational chops to actually get cars built. And you remember the stories where when things were tight, Elon Musk would actually out on the production line himself, which was tremendous. We know that it didn't really change much in terms of the number of cars he himself helped produce, but it's an enormous cultural thing, and helps build a culture that gets everybody completely committed and maniacally focused on getting those cars built and out the door. And of course, in Musk's case, he's not only done this with Tesla, he's also doing it with SpaceX at the same time. So you got a remarkable firm with remarkable technology, and to come back to the quote by Peter Thiel, it's not just the technology, it's the way it's all integrated, the way it's pulled together. So don't forget the systems component, that's critical. So think about why it is that Tesla, from the get-go, decided not to partner, but to actually go build the car. I think conventional wisdom was, hey, if you're a new entrant like Tesla, why don't you go team up with Chrysler or somebody like that? But Elon Musk knows, and the same thing he's doing with SpaceX, he could have done a partnership there either. But when you truly are a pioneer trying to cut, a new way through the industry, you're better off actually doing it yourself. The vertical integration strategy, which of course is what Henry Ford had when he started in the automobile industry. But I'm sure if he had hired a consultant, they would have told him not to do that. And to go and buy stuff off the shelf. That's typically what the efficiency calculus causes you to do. If you're thinking about building things efficiently, you say, well, look, there are mass production of these components already. Let me go and just outsource from everybody else. Well, I'm not saying he hasn't outsourced a lot. He has, but at the same time, he's got complete control of the automobile. And quite frankly, to make it function properly, you have to see the automobile as a system and take control of the system. And the way it's very hard to take control of the system if you're letting somebody else do the manufacturing. So I think it's time to pause here and just see if we have any comments from you. Maybe. Yeah, let's just pause. I've been saying enough, perhaps too much. Let's get some feedback to see how you're thinking about this industry and whether any of the readings you've had so far, the Christensen stuff is helpful here, or the dynamic capabilities stuff is helpful, or the profiting from innovation story is helpful. Put yourself as a CEO of GM or Toyota. What is it you need to know to make high quality decisions? Well, let me put it differently. What style here is likely to succeed in terms of, keeping you alive if you're an incumbent and still in the game, or if you're a new entrant coming in not incumbent, what's going to be your focus? Does anyone like to have a shot at that?
Yeah, Professor Teece, sorry, Ian, can I go? Oh, great.
Yeah,
I was
please.
thinking about this from the profiting for innovation framework. And, as a new entrant, when it comes to autonomous vehicles, Professor Teece, I don't think a dominant design has emerged yet. So for new entrants, when they start thinking about this and, assuming that the software is the central part of it, and not the hardware components such as electric motors and the body parts, etc., I would think it would make sense, pretty similar to what Tesla is doing today, that new entrants continue to focus on the software side of the things, and some of these assets that are still critical but are not specialized are contracted for, while continuing to vertically integrate something that's still core to the vehicle. And that's how I think a new entrant would continue to expand in the autonomous vehicle market.
Well, let me ask you a question. This dominant design concept, and we use the Model T as an example of that, internal combustion engine, four wheels, engine in the front. What are the dimensions of a likely dominant design for autonomous vehicles? LiDAR, everyone has to have a LiDAR, but the question is it going to be, I don't know enough about software to know if there's different sort of types of LiDAR here. The positioning of the LiDAR is probably going to be on the top of the car, right? Wherever it has the most visibility. But what are the elements of standardization that matter here? Can you give me some insight into that?
Yeah, LiDAR is what comes to mind, Professor Teece. Also, the road itself, I think, today there are some standards around how wide a lane should be and, what markers are used on those lanes, what sort of technologies are going to be compatible. That would perhaps get rolled into the design. I'll let others speak to it.
Well, your remarks actually are indicative because look what you're doing. You're talking about standards in the system, not necessarily in the product.
Right.
And by doing that, you're making an important observation, which is this is not just about the product. This is more about the system. And indeed, I think, autonomous cars are going to come first to China because there's a central authority that can standardize the highway system. And we might be able to do it on interstate highways because that's when, the federal government has control there. But what happens when you get off of the federal highways? You got state highways. That means the states have to coordinate with the feds. And, there's great benefits to a decentralized system. But as we saw, as we see with Corona, it's hard to get standardization when you got 50 states that are involved and many counties. So maybe a better system for some things, but it's definitely not for a better system for standardization, or for at least for fast standardization. You might end up actually with better standardization, but it's not going to come fast. So, you need standardization on the roadway. That will clearly come in China first, in my view. So first observation is that yes, we have to define standards not the way Henry Ford did in terms of the vehicle itself, but in terms of the system. And there's going to be safety standards. I mean, clearly safety is going to be a big thing here, and that's the government. So the government, whereas with Henry Ford essentially made the decisions around standardization. Here, you got to have a whole bunch of government officials that are involved in setting standards for autonomous cars. And so it's necessarily going to be a much slower and more cumbersome and more difficult process. Great observations. Any other comments?
Yeah, part of my back to your question about why wouldn't they just partner with one of the existing automotive companies? And my understanding, at least of electric vehicles, is that there is some innovation in terms of the manufacturing, that electric vehicles are simpler to manufacture because there are fewer parts with an electric engine.
Right.
A combustion engine. So I think that as well played a role in Tesla's ability to scale to where they are and ability to scale without the help of a traditional auto OEM.
But why would then Apple be walking around? Why didn't Apple? I think your observation is correct. The gearbox. You have a gearbox with electric motor. It's just the amount of power you put in, right? So you get rid of a lot of parts, and you've got the electric engines on the wheels. This is pretty simple. The electric vehicle is simpler than an internal combustion engine vehicle in some fundamental sense. But then when you add the autonomous component to it, there has to be sensors all over the damn place. The whole car has to be a sensor, basically. So there's much more complexity there, and it's really a computer on wheels rather than wheels with a computer in it, which is what the car traditionally, and in the last 20, 30 years is, my 83 BMW, I think it's got 2 processors in it. I think a modern car's got like 200 processors or something like that. But we're talking about with a Tesla or the future autonomous cars, something orders of magnitude bigger than that. So why would Apple? Well, it's clearly not begging. Apple thinks it's in the driver's seat, so to speak. So it's kind of when Hyundai leaked on it, it walked away. It's not beholden to any one company, but at the same time, why wouldn't they just want to do it all themselves? If you're Tim Cook, why don't you want to make the car yourself?
What's coming to mind for me is just the time to market of, if you're Apple and you're trying to do a huge launch at once, it's way easier if you can tap into someone's existing manufacturing network where they have all of their employees and system integrators and engineers, rather than building your own from scratch. Because, if we look at Tesla, whereas they are now, I think, the number one selling electric vehicle. They weren't that way when they first started. They were running a much smaller batch size. Whereas if Apple is used to working on this like grand global scale, maybe they would want to start with a bigger rollout to match the rest of their portfolio.
Right. Well, but also, Apple, the design is really important for Apple. I mean, if you and I and others in the class are going to buy an Apple car, we expect that Apple feel to it when we step in. This is, we're laying a foundation for Kareem because that's a question we're going to put to him because his focus is on the interior of the car. But can you spec all of that? Can Apple say, okay, just as it is with the iPhone, this is exactly what the product's going to be. Go build it for me. I don't know now, and maybe some of you know, every time there's a new iPhone, how much close cooperation is there between manufacturing and design? There clearly has to be. You can't just be sending over the new plans. There's got to be some, very complex integration questions that come up that impact design and manufacturing. And the question is the iPhone the right model where you can outsource it, or is there a reason to actually keep the manufacturing closer to home, so to speak? Well, I'm just throwing out wild questions here because I don't know the answers. But is there anybody else that, thank you very much, Rachel, for that comment. Does anybody else want to stick their neck out and give us a view? Jeff, what about you? You're brave enough to have your camera on.
Thank you. No problem. I guess guilty as charged, right? You have your camera on. I appreciate you reaching out. I think, again, I think Apple is obviously very good at design, but they're not an economies of scale company. And I think Elon Musk is just the exception, not the rule. And he may have been able to start an automotive manufacturing company from scratch, but short of him, I don't foresee anyone being able to do that. So Apple, in my opinion, is focusing on their core competency, which is in reality, their user-centered design and their, and the ecosystem. So if you look at, I would argue that the App Store made the iPhone valuable or indispensable, I should say. And so I would also argue that, Apple's software should make Hyundai or whomever's autonomous vehicle indispensable rather than Apple ramping up that manufacturing capacity.
Yeah. Well, it'd also be interesting. You started off by saying Elon Musk is the exception. It's not clear Musk is going to build 1 million cars. I mean, what is he up to now? 150,000 or something with the new factory in China. If you're a serious automotive company, you're building more than 1 million a year. He could yet, for all we know, still end up with joint ventures with whoever. These are really interesting questions.
Would you argue that the market is actually incentivizing him, i.e. driving up the stock price and reducing his cost of capital? Is the market incentivizing him to pursue that 1 million cars?
Well, yes, it is pursuing him to do 1 million, but it's not necessarily telling him that he has to build them. He could form an alliance with, I mean, who would take him is the question, I suppose. The thing to recognize is that the amount of capacity to build cars in the world that's not branded is only like 50,000. There's one place up in Canada, I forget the name of the company, that builds cars to orders. And there's a place, I think, in Finland that's doing manufacturing for Mercedes. So, you have to get in bed with an OEM. If there was a large non-branded supplier market that makes generic cars, this would be really easy, wouldn't it? Musk, if they were making high quality products. But there's not. There's only total world capacity is, I think, less than 50,000 cars, and there's what's the total market? 10, 20 million, 10, 15 million cars a year is the total world supply. So they've got to deal with incumbents, and that's where the incumbents are, very protective of their brands. And that's what the fight is all about. Anyway, this is something to watch. And once again, Kareem, Farashia's brand is not, it sort of gets buried. And so everyone's happy to deal with him because the companies that do the interiors have not yet got enough brand power to require the manufacturer to say interior by Faracia or whatever it is as part of the sales gig.
And actually, we might have one more question that's been in queue.
Oh, we do? Oh, wonderful.
If there's time, yeah. Haida, if you want to go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Ian. But my question is a little bit more general. We talk about, Steve Jobs and Elon Musk a lot. And, in general, these sort of larger than life captains of industry. And something that I think about a lot is, are these people, true innovators and pioneers and starting something new? And of course, they are innovating in their fields, but are their innovations durable? Are they going to outlast them? So looking at Steve Jobs, for example, of course he contributed a lot and innovated a lot and created this whole Apple ecosystem. But how successful was he really, since he didn't institutionalize his methods for innovation? Innovation ultimately, at Apple kind of stagnated after his passing. So it kind of goes to what we were talking about in past classes around sort of codifying knowledge that is previously something that is undocumented or that can't be documented, really. So it's kind of an open question. Like, I'm curious about your take on it. Like, what's the difference between a cult of personality and a true innovator?
No, extremely good question. And in fact, in your reading list, there's a little article I wrote in the Huffington Post at the time that Steve Jobs passed away, saying, Apple still has the magic. Look, I think Steve Jobs did, and maybe I'm almost going to borrow some of the work from Kathy Eisenart under Simple Rules. There's certain simple rules that he got established. One is the design has to be really cool. They're not going to let a single product out unless the design is really cool. Secondly, no big acquisitions. Apple's not grown through acquisitions, and Steve Jobs got that simple rule established. Thirdly, sort of be a bit of a maverick. And remember, Steve Jobs really cut his teeth fighting IBM. It was like we're the little guys going after the big bad non-innovative firms, and that one is not continued because now Apple, of course, is it's kind of ironic that IBM was to nothing, and Apple is the largest or the second largest market cap company in the world, depending on the day of the week and the price of the stock. There is an Apple University, which is incredibly secretive, and I've tried to get in there a couple of times. One of my Berkeley colleagues is involved in it. And they, as I understand it, they do a lot of going over sort of the Steve Jobs' mantra and lessons and so forth. And that was there. Steve started that. And of course, Jobs really absorbed so much of the, he was a bit narcissistic like everybody. There's other key people like Johnny Ives and so forth. And of course, initially there was his co-founder that were terribly important to everything that happened at Apple. So So it was always bigger than Steve Jobs. That's point one. Point two, I think Apple did things under Steve Jobs in a sufficiently consistent way that other people could observe it and say, yes, this is the Apple way of doing things. That said, you're also right that there really hasn't been major innovation out of Apple since Steve Jobs. I mean, but the other side of the coin is there hasn't had to. They didn't need major innovation as they've demonstrated. They, drove from nothing to the largest company in the world on the path, if you will, that Steve Jobs gave them with the iPhone and with the iPad, and and brought the Mac computer back into play. I mean, it was barely hanging on with a fraction of a percent of the global market, but my sense is that that's picked up quite a bit. So there was a pathway, if you will, or a roadmap that was established, and with an ecosystem that was in its infancy with the iTunes store and so forth. They were such massively scalable developments that it's got Apple in good shape probably for another decade, but that's unusual. And the question is, can Tim Cook? Tim Cook is clearly, in my view, not an innovative guy. What he's done is just put oil in the machine, and the machine was already wound up well enough. And he's a supply chain management guy, and I don't think any of these guys either. I may have been singing their praises, but I tell you what I think their blind spot is. They've got no idea what's coming to them in terms of the regulatory changes that are going to erupt first in Europe and then in the United States and around the world, that are going to essentially substantially cripple them in significant ways. And they're not at all prepared for that. They're still, in my view, driving blind. Take a look at the Digital Markets Act in Europe. I've been spending a little bit of time on it, and essentially it opens up all the data of Google and Apple and Amazon to anybody and everybody. And it's an effort by the Europeans. If it goes through, it just encourages free riding. It'll cause the margins in the app stores and so forth to be cut in half, and all of these pretty radical things. So for me, the biggest changes they have to deal with is not competition, but regulation. And I don't think they're prepared for it. Just like Bill Gates wasn't prepared at the time, that the antitrust authorities came down on Microsoft. But in the end, he recognized the power of Washington. Microsoft has come back strong, partly as a result. Anyway, I think it is in the organization and not just in the individual. And the media doesn't talk as much about the Johnny Ives of the world as they probably should. That said, the whole dynamic capabilities framework does say the top management team really matters. And I don't have any trouble I think many senior execs do get paid too much because they get paid whether or not they succeed just by getting the stock price up. But at the same time, I can well understand why the premium to top management goes up. In a VUCA environment, if you don't have if you have these entrepreneurial traits, it can lead to enormous differences in performance between companies. So shareholders can potentially benefit. But I think a lot of CEOs that don't have strong dynamic capabilities are being paid as if they do have them. So, but seeing the payoff to the right decision making, like the same thing in a naval battle. You know, whoever's in charge can make a huge difference. The admiral in charge to the success of the outcome. It doesn't mean to say that you give them all the value that's saved or the benefits that are lost. But the point is that management matters, and in particular, top management matters, which is the reason why you should have a Haas MBA as a good stepping stone into a top management position. Just in case you had any doubts. I know you've already paid your tuition, so I didn't really need to give the advertisement, did I? Ian, can we move on? We got another 15 minutes before we break, and then you'll get to meet with Kareem.
Yes, that's great. Thanks.
Okay. So this is just an indication of what's going on in China. Not just domestic brands, but also foreign brands are very, very active in the EV market. Of course, for China, it makes all the sense in the world because they don't have strength in internal combustion engine technologies, and secondly, they don't have oil. So getting away, and they're dependent on the Middle East. I mean, U.S. Navy is protecting the Chinese economy every day by making sure the Straits of Hormuz stay open. But we don't really import any significant oil. Well, we're basically energy independent from a petroleum or hydrocarbon point of view. China and Japan are definitely not. So we're keeping the supply chain open, and China clearly wants to get away from that. So there are multiple reasons why China, as a matter of national policy, is pushing very, very heavy into autonomous vehicles and into electric vehicles. Although it's not necessarily from a carbon point of view, because electric vehicles in China, so much of their electricity supply is from coal-fired power plants that there's no significant carbon benefit from China going from gasoline-powered cars to electric cars. Because they're just substituting burning oil for burning coal, sadly. But, you know, maybe they can pull down those coal-fired plants and build electric ones, but they're building, I don't know, huge numbers of coal-fired plants every year. So no doubt there's, I think all the major brands are active in China. American companies in general haven't made money there, but the German companies have. I mean, something like 40% of BMW's profits, I think, come out of China today. Not so for General Motors, not so for Chrysler, not so for Ford, and not so, I think, for the Japanese cars, but the Germans have done very, very well. Now, of course, China's been quite clever in inviting those companies in under joint venture arrangements, but in every case, that required them essentially to share technology, and they've also required them to not talk about the fact that they require them to share technology. And management of most of these Western companies have been completely asleep at the switch. And in as much as their tenures are short, they've gone along with this, and that's one of the reasons why China is caught up, and why after a 20-year period, the Chinese get the technology, the foreign firm essentially doesn't make any significant money. BMW and Mercedes to the contrary. So there's an interesting study there for someone to look at why the Germans have done so much better in the Chinese market than the Japanese, and American and other European firms. There we go. 40% of BMW's worldwide profits in 2017 came from China. And Andrea Merkel, I think, just doubled down with some new trade agreement with China, which is sort of building on top of the current close economic relations between China and Germany. There we are at the bottom. In 2017, German, Japanese, US brands mostly manufactured were in joint venture plants. None of them wholly owned subsidiaries. Although actually Tesla will be the exception. I think that Jobs at the time, Musk. Sorry, talking about Jobs and Musk, but Musk got the Chinese to change their legislation so that Tesla, I think, is 100% owned. You'll have to fact check me on that, Ian. And it's a massive facility. I'm sure it's financed by China, but owned 100% by Tesla. Now, we have to understand that business organization in China is very different from Europe and the United States, and that a lot of Chinese companies are public and state-owned. And there are, Shanghai Auto, Beijing Auto, and so forth, significant state-owned enterprises. There are also quite a number of private companies, and none of these companies currently export to the United States or to Europe. They're mainly selling to the Chinese market, but with ambitions to sell in the rest of Asia and to sell into the United States and into Europe. And, I think there's a reasonable chance that in the future, you'll see that. And that's why I think it's a matter of national strategy. They're going all out on EVs and autonomous cars, because that gives them a chance. Whenever there's a change in the underlying paradigm, when the dominant design changes, there's always room for new entrants, and China is a new entrant. And so this is when you have to be vigilant as a manager of an incumbent firm to recognize that the competition is going to come from a different place than where it has come from historically. Now, Chinese firms currently dominate in ride-hailing and car-sharing services. These all, of course, depend on 4G technology, and Uber initially was in there in a big way, but they ended up selling out. And if you look at the history of that, the Chinese made it almost impossible for Uber to operate in China. And so they took what they could, which was some return for their initial investment. But the pioneers in ride-hailing and car sharing today are the biggest ones are in China. And also, personal mobility is expanding rapidly, and car sharing is expanding rapidly. So actually, anybody, if talking about sensing and sense making, if you're in the auto industry today, you got to know what's going on in China, because they are going to be more advanced in some areas than you're going to observe in Europe or the United States. It used to be that you'd always look at California as the leading indicator of the global automobile market. In terms of consumer preferences, et cetera. Now, perhaps you should be looking at China as a leading indicator for the global automotive market. So in terms of dynamic capabilities in sensing and sense making, that's where you should look. And once again, we'll pepper Kareem when he comes on with respect to what he's seeing happening in China and happening with Chinese investment in the United States and in Europe and in Japan. So we mentioned this, the ride-sharing companies are quite advanced in China. The most advanced company in self-driving is Beidou. And it's considered in the top 10 globally. I don't know if that's still true. This is 2 or 3 years since I looked at this. So let me just pause there. I think we've covered enough to lay a foundation for Kareem. The China story is one about very rapid advancement in technology. I mean, there wasn't a single automotive manufacturer in China well, they were building, if you go back 30, 40 years, I think they were assembling some Russian models of cars in China. That's all there was. And now, it's a very dynamic industry. And China was open to foreign investment and foreign technology, which is the reason why they caught up so rapidly. But as companies get more realistic about the nature of competition from China, can China stay ahead? And then the gamble they're making is, yes, they will be able to get ahead and stay ahead with the new developments in autonomous vehicles and electric cars. And don't forget about hydrogen. Hydrogen is still in the game. Remember, no one was talking about electric cars until Tesla came along, because batteries didn't have the range. And then the amazing thing that Musk did was show that no, you weren't limited to 150 miles or whatever. The Nissan Leaf and the Japanese cars were all significantly below 200 miles in range. And so everyone believed that the only thing electric cars were for was driving around town, and that it was going to be hydrogen that would take over. And actually, the dominant view is that it is hydrogen that's going to win long term. And Hyundai and Honda and Toyota are very, very strong with the hydrogen vehicles. The problem is, guess what? We don't have enough hydrogen filling stations. So that's the main reason why hydrogen cars have not taken off, is because the complementary assets are missing. But sooner or later, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if you don't see significant infrastructure at the federal government level for hydrogen. And of course, the emissions from hydrogen is zero. The emissions out the tailpipe from hydrogen is zero, but depends on where you get your hydrogen from in terms of what the carbon footprint is. And the carbon footprint, this is where, coming back to sensing, it's going to be very, very important what the carbon footprint of the vehicle is, because clearly now hydrogen is, hydrocarbon, should I say, is very much in a public policy issue, and directives in that regard may favor hydrogen over actually, well, we'll see. If the hydrogen comes from the electric utility grid, then it won't make much difference between electric cars and hydrogen cars. But you have all of these things going on at once, and sensing and sense making. If I was in the automotive industry, I would want to have an army of people doing the research to figure out what's going on everywhere, because the value to figuring this out ahead of time or ahead of the competition is incredibly high. You don't want to be lost. So let me leave it at that, because it's right up on 7:30, and let's just take a normal 15-minute break, and then look forward to a presentation from Kareem Shablin. See you in 15.